This is the second part of a two-part episode on the American GI resistance movement during the Vietnam War. So if you haven't heard the first part, our episode 10, I'd go back and listen to that first. Today, we continue our conversation with Jerry Lembcke, a Vietnam veteran turned author, sociologist and professor, about other aspects of the movement, his experiences in Vietnam veterans against the war, and how it's all remembered today. I'm John.
And I'm Stephanie.
And this is Working Class History.
Gonna lay down my sword and shield down by the riverside, down by the riverside, down by the riverside. Gonna lay down my sword and shield down by the riverside. Study war no more.
One thing that went along with the counterculture in the United States was a lot of drug taking. Was that something which spread to...
A lot.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, most what I saw and saw a lot of was simply pot, which now sounds so innocent. But then it was very illegal, and it was very much a part of underground GI activity in Vietnam, a kind of, well, definitely off the books, illegal, illicit. You know, the drugs were bought on the market, bought illegally, had to be, moved around illegally. All a part of this. I hadn't used the word underground before, but that's a key word. Beyond the purview of the authorities, there was a kind of military life that went on in that way. That when I say the counterculture within the military, the drug culture was part of that. Illicit, underground, out of sight, as much as it could be, violation of rules, smoking pot on guard duty had its own, even beyond military culture, but was a kind of subversion, really, of military policy and the rules, but a kind of subversion of military readiness. My own view, I did guard duty a lot of different places, a lot of fire bases and so forth. And I never liked anybody smoking pot when I was on guard duty because I took it too seriously. And so whenever I was on guard duty, the pot would be withheld most of the time. But I knew it was there, and I knew, other guard posts would be smoking pot. So that was definitely part of it. There's a book called The Myth of the Addicted Army. It's a book that debunks the idea of drug addiction among GIs in Vietnam. Not to say that there weren't people who got addicted, but that it really became exaggerated as a view of what was going on in Vietnam, and it kind of became part of the disparagement of Vietnam veterans after the war, particularly the disparagement of the image of anti-war GIs and anti-war veterans. So during the year I was in Vietnam, I'm not sure that I even heard of or was aware of anything more than marijuana laced with maybe heroin or opiates of some kind. I had heard of that, so I was aware of that. I knew of that, but I can't say that I really saw any kind of addiction or any kind of widespread use or trading, buying and selling of anything other than pot.
That's really interesting.
And I'm not sure, by the way, maybe to get to your point, see, again, I never thought of that at the time, and I still don't, as necessarily being anti-war. It was more stateside counterculture that by 1969 was finding its way into Vietnam. So it was more like it moved from stateside to Vietnam than might be commonly thought of. It moved from Vietnam to stateside after the war, but there is that direction to it also.
Cool,
anyway.
Cool. No, that's really interesting. I hadn't heard that perspective before. About it being sort of exaggerated as a way of almost disparaging. I guess you might.
Oh Oh, very much so.
I guess maybe combat reluctance or whatever you might call it, or whatever the opposite of trigger happy is.
Well, I talked to, fairly recently, I talked to another Vietnam vet, and he was in the field more than I was, and he said that anytime he was ever around, like on a patrol or something, he said nobody would smoke pot. And it was for reasons of being straight enough to be able to defend yourself. And I told him, I said, that surprised me to hear him say that. There's a variety of stories about this, for sure.
Okay. So if, talking about the sort of resistance to authority, this general kind of resistance, not necessarily political anti-war, but general rebellion or the underground. Do you have any idea how widespread that was amongst, was it a small minority or was it, a quite sizable chunk?
Oh, I think by 1969, when I left in February of 70, well, it was widespread. There was no doubt that it was affecting, the term was military readiness. Absolutely no doubt about that. And, part of the Nixon drawdown, that began in 1969, besides opposition to the war, stateside, was simply the lack of preparedness of the military in Vietnam to carry out the war. And some of this is portrayed, of course, in the film Sir, No Sir, with the Air Force guys refusing to collect the intelligence for air operations, and guys refusing to board ships, aircraft carriers, and so forth. There was a small number of refusals of pilots to fly by that time in the war. It was widespread by 1970.
Cool. And I mean, obviously, the U.S. military force at the time was mostly male, but what can you tell us about, the role and contribution of women to the GI resistance movement?
Oh, it was huge. Many of the first and most prominent and most effective people in the anti-war movement back stateside were women. Gosh, the first delegation of American peace activists went to Hanoi not to negotiate. They had no authority to do that, but to treat with the North Vietnamese was Women's Strike for Peace. It was an all-women's group that went. And then there were the other early peace groups that went. The Quakers, who chartered a boat in Taiwan, I guess, raised money, loaded the boat with military supplies to take to North Vietnam. That was men and women, but there were women on that trip also. A 1967 group that went. Tom Hayden was one of the people, but Vivian Rothstein was one of the people. Carol McEldowney was one of the people who went. Vivian Rothstein was 21 years old when she went. And they were in Hanoi for more than 2 weeks because they couldn't get a flight out of Vietnam, and they were there. So those people came back then to the United States as very, very effective organizers, very effective spokeswomen for the anti-war movement. I'm trying to think of some of the other women's organizations. Women's International League for Peace and Freedom is one of the long-standing anti-war organizations going back to World War I. They were very active very early on. You get celebrity figures like Joan Baez, just a very effective voice. When I came back, my first best friend was a woman who had gone to a Quaker boarding school in Iowa and was the campus anti-war singer at the University of Northern Colorado in Greeley. I went back to graduate school, met her in the fall of 1970, and I married her, actually. And so it was women like her who really reached out to Vietnam veterans and invited us into the anti-war movement. So huge, hugely important.
Cool. I think Stephanie just wanted to ask a quick question. Stephanie?
Sure.
So it sounds like women's contribution is erased from public memory.
Well, even worse than erased, I think, is vilified. The intersection there is with the historical fact that the war was lost. And so Americans went looking for reasons why the war was lost, which turned inward to look for scapegoats for the loss of the war. And culturally, the scapegoat became the feminization of American culture. We, the Americans, lost the war because we had turned soft. We lost the war because we had become too encumbered by welfare. Our men had become feminized by the women's movement. It was this whole kind of paranoia and vilifying of the, quote, feminism within the culture. And so people like Joan Baez and Jane Fonda became really lightning rods for the anti-war movement. The loss got put at the feet of home front betrayal, that we lost the war because of what happened at home. Women were the main targets of that. Part of the general backlash against the women's movement and against the feminist movement was because of that. You might know the book, the title is Backlash, isn't it? I'm trying to think of the author's name. The book came out probably 15 years ago. The author of that book referenced my book, The Spitting Image, as a way of making her point that the origins of the backlash against the women's movement really lie in the loss of the war. My book was important in that way because, according to the myth of spat upon Vietnam veterans, a lot of the spitters were women or young girls. Supposedly, they're the ones who spat on Vietnam veterans, which is a reprise of the German stab-in-the-back legend of World War I. Supposedly, German soldiers came home from having lost World War I, and they were greeted by women who lashed out at them. And indeed, stories of German women spitting on German veterans went around as part of the stab-in-the-back legend. Well, it actually became very much part of the movement to remilitarize and Nazify German culture that then led up to World War II.
I think it's a really interesting historical parallel.
It certainly is.
Because obviously the real reason World War I ended was there was a mass mutiny in the Russian army and a revolution, and then there was a mass mutiny and a revolution in Germany, by the soldiers and workers themselves. And
absolutely.
Yeah.
Very much a parallel, and the gist of almost all of these books that I've written, really the bottom line is that because of Vietnam, America is itself living in a lost war culture, a post-empire culture that is as revanchist and reactionary as was Germany after World War I. All of that played out in Germany within a 20-year period. And here it's just been on slow burn and playing out now 45 years since the end of the war. But my contention is that we are still in that lost war culture formed by the loss of the war in Vietnam. And if anything, the Trump movement, with its hyper-masculinity, its rebuild America, make America great again, see, that's the revanchist part of it, that there was something lost sometime in the past, and we have to get back to that. We have to recover that. And of course, that is the idyllic, mythical America of the 1950s. And where were women in the 1950s? They were not in the streets. And so putting women back in their place is all part of that revanchism of the Trump administration. Yeah.
Yeah.
You're exactly right. It's very parallel, and that's very much what my these last 4 books have been about.
I mean, I guess also, in terms of, them, I guess, right wingers blaming a loss on a sort of feminine, not being aggressive enough, I guess, is just, at least from my understanding, is massively flawed from a strategic perspective, because it seems like the South Vietnamese and US forces policies of like mass burning of villages and mass torture and killings of innocent civilians and peasants actually turned, the majority of the countryside in South Vietnam against, put them on the side of the Viet Cong.
Oh, yes. Yes, and where I thought you were going to go with that is that lots of women fought on the side of the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese.
Oh, yeah, of course, that too, actually, yeah.
American soldiers encountered enemy women fighters maybe for the first time in American history. They would capture Vietnamese in the South, and my God, it's a girl, and that was a real shock to Americans. Or even worse, from the American point of view, pilots shot down over the north would be captured by North Vietnamese women, and marched to Hanoi by women soldiers, and U.S. soldiers captured in the South and moved north along the Ho Chi Minh Trail saw lots and lots of women, Vietnamese women, working militarily on the Ho Chi Minh Trail, defending the trail, with anti-aircraft guns, defending the trail in lots of ways. I did get to this, by the way, in my book, Hanoi Jane. And I think that this is a kind of, subtext. There's a kind of latent narrative here in the anti-woman sentiment, in this betrayal narrative, that comes out of that experience in Vietnam. Other than what I've written in my book, I don't know that anybody else has touched on that. And it certainly needs to be better developed than what I did in that book.
One thing that I meant to ask back at the time, we then kind of got onto another topic, was you mentioned GI Underground Press, which you said you were aware of in the US, around military bases and things. Did that reach Vietnam itself?
No, not when I was there. I think maybe about the time I left, it probably was reaching there, but I did not see any underground press. I was aware of something called pirate radio, and again, this is portrayed in Sir, No Sir. Some GIs, in the communication, communication units, patched together some kind of clandestine radio operations. I think there was more than one, and I did hear of that, but I don't think I ever heard any of those broadcasts myself. At least I don't remember, or if I did, maybe I didn't know what I was hearing. We did hear, I guess we call it Radio Saigon, portrayed in the film Good Morning Vietnam, the Robin Williams film, which I love, by the way, that film. And we did hear those broadcasts that sometimes had their own anti-war flavor to them, and thus sometimes would be censored and kicked off the air. But that was it. The first anti-war newspapers didn't appear, even stateside, until sometime in 1968, if I'm not mistaken. So, it would have taken a while for that stuff to find its way abroad. And in any case, and maybe then even maybe in Saigon, it would have been, then it was called Saigon, maybe would have been around, or in other big, large military installations along the coast. But that's not where I was. I was more inland, smaller places, more confined and more controlled. A lot of times when I hear stories about GI resistance, I mean, I'm thinking, how would that have ever happened where I was? Because we were really under the thumb of military authority. So, things really had to be underground. When you're that far out, when you're out in the boonies, I don't know how newspapers even would have gotten out there very easily. Guys could, like I did, I brought back stuff from Sydney on R&R. So, that would be one source of things.
That's really interesting, actually. And I mean, I was kind of maybe aside from the interview, but in terms of, what you said about the type of base and even the geographical location, I think it would, because, as well as doing this podcast, we're doing some stuff like mapping social movements kind of geographically and through time. And I think it would kind of be really interesting to try and map out some of these either concrete incidences and data and kind of see, whereabouts this stuff happened and what was. Do you see what I mean? Like, and I think that'd be a kind of interesting bit of research to do at some point. But
it sure would be.
But because that's interesting. I hadn't really thought.
I hope somebody is listening. An enterprising graduate student who's looking for their PhD.
Yeah. No. Exactly.
And this is one that's waiting to be done.
Fingers crossed. You came back to the United States in 1969.
Early in 70. Yeah.
Oh, early in 70. Okay. Back in the US, how was the GI resistance represented and portrayed? And do you know how much popular support it had?
Well, I came back ready to join the anti-war movement, and I came back looking for the anti-war movement. And contrary to the stories today that anti-war activists met returning GIs at the airport and harassed them and spat on them, I was disappointed when I landed at McChord Air Force Base, was processed through Fort Lewis in Washington, and then it went to SeaTac Airport, and I was disappointed that there was no anti-war people at SeaTac. So I was looking for the anti-war movement, and I found it shortly in the Denver area of VVAW and joined up with VVAW by the spring of 1970. I was quite active by then in VVAW. And yes, by that time, VVAW had quite a presence. The first, what it called the Winter Soldier hearings that asked for testimony about atrocities in Vietnam and a lot of the same kind of questions that you're asking, called for GIs to offer their testimonies. Those got a certain amount of news coverage. Vietnam veterans had become, by that time, pretty regular participants in anti-war activities, marches, rallies, speaking at rallies and so forth, marching as their own contingent in anti-war marches. And so, I know, the American people were very, very well aware by that time that people were coming home from Vietnam opposed to the war and were joining the anti-war movement in large numbers. So again, that was one of those. The turning point was fall of '69. The really fall of '69 was a kind of a real coming out for VVAW. It had been in formation since 1967, but it really kind of stepped out, outed itself publicly in 1969. And so from then on, the GI press had really taken off. There were lots of coffee houses near military bases. So it was very much a movement.
And I mean, being part of a movement like that, and, being part of a community of resistance, how did that feel on kind of a personal, emotional level? And do you have any, are there any particular instances of it that stay with you?
Oh, absolutely. A lot of veterans report coming home being well received by friends and family, but with not much interest in where they had been the last year, and really not finding a community with whom they could debrief and commiserate about it. But that's what the anti-war movement was for lots of us. The anti-war movement was the community that we came back to, the community that we found or that found us, people who wanted to hear our stories and wanted us to hear about what the anti-war movement had been doing in their behalf. And so it's really, your word of community, I think, is really, in a lot of ways, the key word. Part of what then happens, I think, to a lot of Vietnam veterans is that as the war begins to wind down and end, so too did the anti-war movement. And so people who had found a place, a home, so to speak, a community within the anti-war movement began to lose that then as the anti-war movement dissipated, and were then kind of left hanging, well, what now? Because still, friends and family, were even less interested, by 1973, 4 or 5 than they had been before. And so that was a different set of emotions that I think that began to play out.
Right. But I guess that must have been quite sad, basically.
Being involved in the anti-war movement was a really invigorating, and really to meet these people who had been doing all these things all these years to oppose the war, for me was real inspiring, and it made me want to be like them. They became, kind of aspirational for me. For me personally, that was a real turning point. It really had me rethinking, my life up to the time I got drafted, and rethinking my own educational experience, which was the educational experience of, the vast majority of Americans my age had arrived at. The Vietnam War years just totally bereft of any consciousness, any awareness of what this country was about, what it had been about.
Yeah. Well, I guess, that's kind of a good point to move on to kind of legacy a bit. And nowadays, as you say, the film Sir No Sir and some other recent, articles online have helped raise the profile of the GI resistance a little bit, but it's still generally pretty unknown in kind of wider society. Why do you think this is?
I think GI resistance and GI resistors, I think the image, the legacy of them got pathologized. Our political engagement got rewritten as a kind of catharsis, a kind of pathetic, acting out of our war trauma. That's the subtitle of my book on PTSD, Diagnosis or Identity in Post-Empire America. The political and cultural, I think I said that, at the outset, the political and cultural properties of PTSD, the diagnostic category, was to discredit the authenticity of the political voice, the political authenticity of the veteran resistance. It was a way of depoliticizing what we were doing and what we were saying, a way of saying, oh, yes, well, they came home upset about the war, or they came home feeling guilty about what they had done in the war. They came home traumatized about the very atrocities that they had committed in the war. And so they're experiencing that post-traumatic stress. And so, yes, we should be sympathetic with these guys. We should see that they get the treatment that they deserve, but the political meaning of it then is kind of ellipsed, right? It's kind of erased. It's kind of disappeared. And what comes out of that period then is the image of trauma-stricken veterans and the image of our political activity as having been cathartic, a kind of acting out of their anger, of their hurt, of their trauma. So that's the image that goes forward. That sometimes in my classes related to this, I would ask students if they had ever heard of Vietnam Veterans Against the War or Vietnam War resistance movement and so forth. And, almost no students would raise their hand in the 90s. I'd say, well, anybody heard of Vietnam veterans with PTSD? Well, almost all hands would go up. So the image that people have of Vietnam veterans largely now is that of the home with hurts, damaged goods image of Vietnam veterans. No image, no legacy. People politicized and empowered by their wartime experience. You see, from 1970 to 1973, 1975, that was the image that Americans had of Vietnam veterans. We came home to kick ass on the Nixon administration. I mean, if there was going to be any spitting when I came home, it was going to be me on some politician or some officer that I'd had in Vietnam, and I recognized him in civilian clothes. That was my state of mind. Nobody's going to spit on me. And, of course, nobody did spit on me. That storyline wasn't even there. Nobody was even claiming in the early 70s that anybody was spitting on Vietnam veterans. I know. I went back and looked, right? It's not even there. That narrative's not even there. That gets constructed after the war. And by the way, on trauma, you see the initial trauma that Vietnam veterans supposedly experienced was the trauma of coming home. That's where all of this PTSD stuff started. It wasn't war trauma per se. It was the trauma of coming home. It was the treatment of Vietnam veterans upon their homecoming. That was the first iterations of the war trauma narrative. And of course, it was the enemy at home that rejected Vietnam veterans and traumatized Vietnam veterans. So in the first instance, PTSD is about the homecoming story. And then, of course, it gets expanded. It gets expanded out from there. But that was the starting point. We were traumatized because we were badly treated. We were rejected. And maybe the big player here is, and we lost the war because of betrayal on the home front. You see, You lose a war, that in itself is a lot of trauma. Those German soldiers who came home from World War I, having lost a war, that's hard to deal with.
Jerry's written in detail about the myth of spat-on war veterans, which we'll link to in the show notes. In actual fact, the anti-war movement reached out to veterans to join them, and many anti-war protests were led by contingents from Vietnam veterans against the war, often in uniform. In perhaps their most famous act of protest, nearly 1,000 veterans headed to the US Capitol building in Washington, D.C. in April 1971 to return their combat medals to the government. The vets had planned to give the medals back in body bags, but authorities, in fear of the vets, erected a fence around the Capitol building. So instead, the veterans threw their medals over the fence, giving a few choice words as they did so. When the US was forced to pull out of Vietnam, a convenient narrative had to be devised to explain what happened.
You say, well, why did we lose the war? Who was the enemy? Well, it wasn't the Vietnamese. They could have never beaten us. It was our own kind. It was loss on the home front. It was betrayal behind the lines. It was the stab in the back, you see. And there was a gender to that, right? And that was easily gendered because who was it who was really leading the anti-war movement? Well, a lot of them were women, or if not women, male long hairs, hippies, men who weren't really men, who were part of the anti-war movement, who weren't men enough to suit up and go off to fight the war, men who stayed home to work in hospitals or nursing homes rather than load artillery pieces. You see, it all fits. All the pieces fit.
Today, 50 years on, pretty much, why do you think the GI resistance and how we remember it is important today?
Oh, I think the key to the anti-war movement today is somehow to get to the people who are going off to fight these wars. The key lies within that demographic of recruits to these wars, the people who are off fighting these wars. We've got to counter-recruit. We've got to counter-propagandize these. Well, the war in Vietnam ended when the U.S. was no longer able to prosecute the war. The war ended when the Vietnamese stopped the U.S. war machine. And they stopped the U.S. war machine with the help of the anti-war movement at home and with the help of a generation of men who refused to fight the war any longer. All of those pieces are important. And all of those pieces are still important today. And we can't, by the time I came home from Vietnam or shortly thereafter, I came to think that there was a righteous side to that war, and we just weren't on it. And so it was right for the Vietnamese to win that war, not just to stop the war, but to win the war. Their cause was a righteous cause. Today, that's trickier. I don't know that there is a righteous cause in these wars, so it behooves us to fight against these wars today from the inside, from our own side, from the American side, and fight in the American military.
Do you think that there is a call to action for media producers, makers specifically?
Oh, huge, huge. I would like to see media ferret out more of the resistance, current resistance within the military than what they're doing. I say that only on a hunch that there must be more going on. Iraq Veterans Against the War has been very courageous and very resourceful, but it hasn't gotten the support from the outside that it really needs. And a lot of that can come, I think, from the media, not just giving more prominence to Iraq Veterans Against the War, but to dig a little more deeply, as I think maybe you're suggesting, to dig a little more deeply into what is actually going on within the military and find the cracks within the military that can be spread a little bit broader than they are. And also, something that we had then that we don't seem to have now is resistance from religious organizations. We're not getting the support for resistance from the churches like is portrayed in the film Sir, No Sir. I wonder why churches are not offering themselves as sanctuaries today for people who don't want to go, or a lot of the military units today are guard units and reserve units that are being activated as whole units from rather small cities and towns across the country. Why aren't the religious organizations in these towns, targeting these hometown military organizations and the people within them, winning them over en masse to a more of an anti-war position? It seems to me to be a strategy that's kind of waiting to be pursued.
How did, participation in the GI resistance shape and change your life on a personal level?
Oh, the two words that I like to use a lot are empowerment and politicizing. Both of those, but I think for your question, I think it's empowerment. In VVAW, I met some of the best public speakers, some of the most effective, and a lot of that was people with a lot of self-confidence, a lot of, chutzpah, courage, innovative thinking, not intimidated, audacious personalities. And they kind of became role models for me. And then at some point, there has to be an academic component of this, just wanting to know more about the war and how the United States got into it, and thus how I got into it. What was it that I got swept up in that drug me into this war? And for about 3-4 years after I was home from Vietnam, I was just like a sponge. I read and I read and I read. And even though I had already been to college, I was a math major, I really began to educate myself. And that was very empowering. And of course, it was very politicizing also. And it was very much a part of, to use the word that you gave me, community. Being around other people like that I'd never been around before. I had never known people like this. People who were Quakers. I've met people who had gone to jail rather than going to the war. That was all part of it.
What is something that you wish sort of people wouldn't either know or remember about that whole Vietnam era and what happened?
Well, the thing that keeps coming up in conversations, it's the generational thing. Why? And there's no answer to this, which is why I think the question continually needs to be asked. What was there about that generation, that 60s generation, that turned out the people that it did? And mostly when I think about that, I think about people in the anti-war movement, but as a subset of that, the military people who then joined, like myself, who joined the anti-war movement. I've just been doing some reading recently about these young people who went to Hanoi as part of these peace delegations. I mentioned some of them earlier. Tom Hayden, he was 26 years old when he went to Phnom Penh in Cambodia by himself and negotiated the first release of U.S. POWs from the Viet Cong. I would not even just wanted to have been a tourist in Cambodia.
Tom Hayden was a well-known anti-war activist, right?
Not so much then. This was in, I think, maybe as early as 1966. In any case, he was 26 years old. Those countries were not pleasant places to travel in, for just basic health reasons and security reasons, and in the 1960s. You know what I mean? I mean, you didn't run into a lot of English-speaking people in Phnom Penh, Cambodia in the mid-1960s. And it took you probably a week of flying just to get from New York to Phnom Penh. Many, many stops along the way, and all kinds of problems with visas and passports. Where did people, where did they come from, right? I mean, I know Tom Hayden's background very well, so I know basic answers to that. Well, and so the basic answers to that, which would still then leave unanswered. What was it? What was it that empowered and politicized a whole generation of people? Well, I know there are not easy answers to that. And as I said, the question keeps getting asked of me, what do I think of that? All I think about is that that's just such a really good question. And it's one of those things that probably you can't expect that history to repeat itself. There will be another generation that makes those kinds of changes. We can't see that any more on the horizon than somebody could have seen that generation of the 60s. Certainly wouldn't have seen that from the 50s. Not at all. If anything, the opposite. So a real study of history.
Yeah, and I think calls for optimism in dark times.
Sure. That's a good way to put it.
That point about the 50s is a very good idea, because I guess that was famously, a time of
darkness,
general compliance and social peace and obedience.
Absolutely.
At least amongst, say, the white working class, especially in the US, because also in the 50s, you did have the, amongst African Americans, you had the start of the civil rights movement.
Sure.
Which had, really started to change things. Yeah. So, I mean, maybe a sort of final question.
Sure.
What do you think that we can do to kind of refocus how, we collectively think about Vietnam and the GI resistance? And how do you think, we can make that shift in how we remember it?
Oh, I think this image of the GI resistance as a kind of pathology, I think that needs to be rewritten again. I think the GI resistance movement needs to be recovered. I think the film Sir No Sir was really important, is really important. I think it had its moment within Iraq Veterans Against the War, and emulating some of that resistance within the war. So I think more things like that. but all done with the kind of presentist orientation. So always with an eye on what do we need to know from the past that will be useful in our present.
Well, thank you for tuning in. We hope you enjoyed listening to Jerry and Bart as much as we did. Thanks also to our Patreon supporters who make this podcast possible. You too can support us on Patreon, where you'll get early access to episodes and other benefits. For example, episode 8 of our podcast is about the strike wave, which took place in the US during the Vietnam War. And at the moment, that is available exclusively for our Patreon supporters. So you can check all that out at patreon.com/workingclasshistory. As always, links to further reading and more info in the show notes, including a link to a short video history we made of the GI resistance movement for our YouTube channel. We've also produced a range of merchandise commemorating the GI resistance, which is in our online store. Check it out at workingclasshistory.com. One aspect of the movement we haven't been able to cover as much as we wanted to was the really crucial role played by African American servicemen and other service personnel of colour. So if any of our listeners were involved in the movement and would be happy to speak with us, please get in touch. Also, if anyone's interested in helping us map the resistance movement, as we discussed a bit earlier on, please drop us a line as well. You can get us at info@workingclasshistory.com.
I ain't gonna study war no more, ain't gonna study war no more, ain't gonna study war no more. I ain't gonna study war no more, ain't gonna study war no more, ain't gonna study war no more.
This episode was edited by Stephanie Heidel. Thanks again, and catch you next time.